Lisa Melandri, the director here at the Contemporary Art Museum, and this is, for me, a great treat. This is the last event in our year-long celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Contemporary, which has been a really, really interesting, fruitful, and wonderful year to sort of look back and see how we came to be, who made it possible, why we look the way we do, and to really sort of celebrate the accomplishments of the museum and also be able to look forward. So we have assembled here to my left the voices of great knowledge and vision and ladies who really brought this all to fruition. And so, as I say, a treat for me as well, because this has been a real learning year for me to be able to look back and reconnect with so many of the people who charted the course of the evolution of this institution. So, Emily Pulitzer, and Betsy Millard. And I am only here to ask some questions and to stimulate some discussion. And we also hope that certainly at the end, but even we were making a joke earlier that if there's anything that people have to say about their memory or whatever, we do want you to pipe up. And Bob was saying he will raise a finger to let us know if there's any misinformation that has been given. And with that, I'd like to just sort of launch right in and have this chance to culminate the year in a little bit of thinking, not just about 2003, not just about the actual opening of this building, but the thought processes, the cultural milieu, the kind of larger state of St. Louis and of the Forum prior to the Contemporary, to kind of bring us up to speed and help us understand what did St. Louis look like at this moment when this undertaking came to pass? What were some of the, what did audience for contemporary art look like? What was indeed the history of this institution prior to its current iteration? So I would love to start with that and just talk about, the Forum specifically, but also St. Louis in the 1990s with regard to cultural institutions, and have that sort of lead us into the moment, the aha moment of making us a bricks and mortar permanent home. Please.
Okay. Being the oldest and having, is this on? Yeah.
I think so. Can you hear?
And having been around the longest, I guess I'm the only still active member of the original board of the First Street Forum. Evelyn Newman was one of the founders, and she's still around. But anyway, that came about because there was the feeling that there was no cultural activity downtown. So we had a tiny space on First Street, and we did all different kinds of exhibitions. We then moved to 555 Washington and changed our name to just the Forum from First Street's Forum, since we were no longer there. And our timing was fantastic. It coincided perfectly with the construction of Metrolink. And so nobody could get to the front door. And what's more, the building was vacant except for the Forum. And we had a director at that point who realized that there wasn't enough contemporary activity in St. Louis, and the way we were operating, we were something different with every exhibition, and so people didn't really have a grasp on what we were or what we really were doing. And so the director got the board to accept a new mission, which was to be for contemporary art. She did that, but she didn't raise much money. And so we ended up That was not Betsy. Absolutely not.
Not that I raised much money, but.
And Betsy at the time was the contemporary curator at the Art Museum and had lots of energy, as she still has, lots of ideas, and was not being allowed to fulfill them. And so she came to me and said, you know, I really would like to be the director of the forum. And I said, Betsy, I really like you too much. I'm not sure we're going to survive. I think you should go back and try to make things better at the Art Museum. So 6 months passed, and she came back and said, I really do want the job. And I felt, well, you know, we're stable enough that maybe we can make a go of it. And I'll never forget, we had a group of board members to meet with Betsy, and the head of Darcy was one of them. And when I talked about Betsy, I could just hear him saying, there's Emmy with another one of her artsy types. Well, he had to leave the meeting before it was over, and he motioned to me to leave with him, and he said, grab her. So we did. And so Betsy really came on when we moved to Grand Center. Is that?
No.
No?
No.
Okay,
No.
you carry on from there.
I came on, and I got and I still have it actually, a wonderful letter from Emmy at the time I was hired that said, which I always liked, that she said, we're somewhere between short pants and long pants. And we really were. I was hired at 555 Washington, and I remember the trying to find our way into the front door because it was always changing when Metrolink was being built. They'd keep moving the chain link fence on us. And so it was a challenge, and we decided that this has to be a destination for people. So we started right off with some fabulous exhibits, you know, eyes wide open, going into it. We had a Nam June Paik show, wonderful show of portraits, some of you remember, and I think Van did a few things around that show, as did the New Music Circle. And we had about 4 shows. Right about in the middle of it, we got a notice from the owners of the building, which happened to be a bank because the building was in bankruptcy. We didn't own the building, we were renters. And that's one of the interesting things, is the forum always went where there was opportunity. People say, hey, you want a space? And, you know, yeah, we'll be there. And in this case, the building went into bankruptcy and was then sold to the post office. To the post office? To the post office. And we were given, so I got there and we were given, essentially, we talked them into giving us about 4 months to move. We had nowhere to go. We had no money. Chuck Cook can remember this, because we also got a notice that when they did the survey of the building, they found out that we'd neglected to install an electric meter. So, by the way, you owe us 3 years of back electric.
Oh, God.
And and they don't give it away. we tried. So we were paying that off. We were doing all kinds of things. But we took it seriously. We took seriously, where should we go? And we did. We had board members who thought we should go to the Galleria and open up there, because that's where the people were. We had we had interest in South St. Louis on the Hill. We had interest in the Central West End. You should go there. And we thought we need to look at Grand Center. And we really did look in places all over the city. But it came down to a very good, heartfelt discussion about what is this institution. And if the institution is dedicated to contemporary art and the institution is dedicated to the arts and culture and to being on the edge, in a sense, we should go to Grand Center, which at that time was pretty on the edge. Ronny Greenberg bless his heart, had the space here in Grand Center, and the Regional Arts Commission was on the second floor, and Ronny had a gallery on the first floor. The third floor was empty and raw, and he said, we can work this out, and you guys can have the first floor and the third floor. So for the rest of my time, we sandwiched rack. And we had actually, it was a pretty neat space. The third floor was definitely much more raw than the first floor, and Dana was there in the early days. She remembers all that, and this funny elevator that took us between floors, so, which we actually ended up using for a gallery space.
Oh, you did?
The freight elevator. We had a great gallery. Yes, remember Lucy Harvey had an incredible installation of a shrine in there that was just amazing. And Barry McGee did some little surreptitious drawings on the way up when he did his show. It was so, I loved coming and seeing your use of the bathroom and the hallways, and it's right in line, so.
And at that time then, Forum for Contemporary Art had the, phrase contemporary art in it, and was that it wasn't
Changed
always
the name.
like that.
When we moved from 555 Washington
To Ronny Greenberg's
oh,
building.
there's Ronny. Yay, Ronny. Yes, that's when we changed the name and added For Contemporary Art. And the Forum was founded by a group of really, really dedicated people, and they really liked the name Forum, and I was always a bit pushing against it, but we compromised by adding contemporary art to it. And then the other name change came later.
And was it the only dedicated contemporary exhibition space at that time?
Well, the Laumeier was
that's true. That's
dedicated
right.
to contemporary art, but we were the only non-collecting space, and the only space. And Laumeier just had the house, and so they didn't have a whole lot of gallery space there. And the museum, we had the current shows. We actually, when you think back on it, we had quite a bit of contemporary art, but it was always pulling teeth to get things going. And I decided that's why I thought, well, if you're going to beat your head against the wall, you might as well beat it against a wall that you built instead of a wall somebody else is building for you to beat it against. So that was one of the reasons I talked to Emmy about making the change.
So let's talk about that. So at some point during your tenure and while you were here in Grand Center, you bring an idea into a really serious discussion about a permanent home, about bricks and mortar. What was the moment, and what was the reasoning behind what it would do for the institution to give it a home?
Well, I think we found that every time, and having gone through, and many people in this room having gone through the initial move from First Street Forum to 555 Washington, which they thought would be a permanent home, but then being kicked out of that, and then making all that foray and really talking about it, we realized Grand Center would be the home, and that every time you change locations, you start over. I was there 10 years after, I started 10 years after the institution opened. And 5 years into my tenure, people were still saying to me, well, we're just not sure you're going to be here in a couple years. It was always very tenuous, which makes it very hard to plan ahead and fund. And we realized this is a place that you need to have. You need a building. You need that identity. You need that place where people know exactly where it is and where it's going to be. Because we were always renters. It was time to grow up.
So a building is about sustainability.
Yeah.
In people's minds and eyes, right?
Yeah.
So the program was going on. You were 20 years old, but because you'd had these different chapters, it didn't feel like the continuous 20 years.
Yeah.
I want to hear a little bit about the actual process by which you decided on an architect, but I'm also curious, I'm not sure what is chicken and egg with regard to the name change. And I want to know what your feeling was. So you said forum was something that didn't necessarily sit well with you, but the idea of contemporary art museum, and there are other contemporary art museums in the country, and sort of what brought you to that and why.
Do you remember that, Emmy?
Well, I think the name change occurred once we came into the building.
But we made it before and started the process, because
Yeah.
I was still there when we made the change. And I remember one of the things that was the sort of the icing on the cake. We always talked about forum as a really great name for a program. This idea of a forum where people come together and exchange ideas and things like that. But it's harder to think of that as the name of an institution. And then back in whatever year that was, 1999 or so, all of a sudden there was this weird dating site called The Forum. Remember this? And they had ads. They had ads on the radio and television. And we kept getting these phone calls. Oh, God. Do you remember this? And it was like, all right, we have a chance here. We've got to do it. Because it was this they were kind of shady. So you look in the phone book, and there was the Forum Deli, and there was this weird, so it was time. It was time.
All right, so take us through the architecture part of this. And I was particularly interested to learn about the sort of collaboration with Washington University and this sort of larger programmatic part of architect selection. So just talk us through.
Go ahead, because you've refreshed yourself on some of the details that I've forgotten, but it was a process that I was very proud of.
Yeah, and it started long before we actually got to the point of bringing anybody here. And Stephen Lead is in the room, and he is one of the real reasons. Because Steve always talked about architecture all the time, and he was you were on our program committee. Yes. And always pushing architecture. We need to do. And so, it just kind of started the list-making idea of, keeping track of ideas of architects that were interesting. And I think you also were the person who said to me, what architect wouldn't want to build, one, for this program, and two, well, number one, next to the Ondo, and two, with the program of contemporary art space. I mean, that draw alone should not hold you back from asking anybody in the world. You just have to decide who might be a good fit. So Emmy, who was all over the world, and still is all over the world, started asking people about architects, and we just started this long, long list of architects and just looking up, and we had wonderful selection committee. In the early part, before we were a formal committee, Stephen was adding to that list, and also Terry Riley, who was at that time was the chief curator of architecture at MoMA, and William Curtis, who was author, an architectural historian
and writer.
Yeah. So this big long list started to happen, and I actually brought you the discs with the files because I thought all of a sudden. But I went to look for them, and I pulled them out, and I realized how long ago this was because they're actually floppy disks. So, history. So the architect selection committee, though, was made up of Allison Faring, who is a board member, Terry Good, Steve Leet, me, Donna Moog, who I think is not here tonight, Emmy, Tom Rich, who was a wonderful member of the committee who was construction manager. So we had that side of things. Pat Schuchard, artist, and at that time was a board member, and Cynthia Weiss, who was the Dean of Architecture at WashU, and then Terry and Bill Curtis were on sort of standby. So, and then Do you remember how we got to the 6? That's what we can't remember, or 7?
We don't remember that. But we did then invite them, one by one, to come to St. Louis, see the site, give a talk, a public talk at Washington University.
Yeah.
That was really good because it educated all of us as well as educating the potential architect with the community and with the site.
And what we knew was, we had a couple things. We knew we didn't want a Frank Gehry, for instance. We knew we wanted somebody who was, people who were younger, who had never built in this country, who weren't, of the same necessarily generation or stature as Tadao Ando. We wanted, because we're the young, fresh, emerging institution. Those are the people we showed, so we wanted to be that as part of the architect selection as well. And we had no money, literally no money to do this, so having architects give us proposals of the site and what they would do here was out of the question. We could pay their travel and their hotel. They got no fees for speaking. We partnered with WashU and their lecture series, so we'd have a place to do it. And Steve was great and did the poster for us out of WashU because we had no printing budget. And we decided that we rationalized all this by saying that it was really, and I do think it was important, that they come with no preconceived ideas. That they actually come and that it was going to be about how they reacted to the building, to the Ando building, to the site, and to us as a community.
And during this period when they began to come to do these lectures, how done were you?
Not very far.
Okay. So it wasn't like you were in the midst of
We
construction.
opened a year before. Was it 1 year or 2 years?
I think it's
before?
one.
It was
Yeah.
2.
2. So
Two?
that says that we weren't all that far
Yeah.
along.
Okay.
Yeah, the roof, there was no roof.
Okay.
The spaces. Yeah, there were,
Yeah, this
Construction.
was used as a construction support site.
Your building is on this site.
Yeah, well, the construction.
Yeah.
right. So it
Trailers
couldn't start until we were finished. Somebody had a question?
I'm sorry, this might be a really tough question. So you started construction out of architect?
no.
Of the Pulitzer
The
Foundation.
was
The
under
Pulitzer.
construction.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I mean, you own the land,
Yep.
or
Yes,
the Pulitzer Foundation owned the land?
and we gave it to the Contemporary.
Yes. This was the site of the old Beaumont Medical Building, which was,
Beaumont Medical Building and garage.
and parking. This was
on
the parking
both-
garage.
On this whole site.
And who were the 6 or
the
7? 7.
This is where I needed my cheat sheet.
Okay, this is good.
So we had 7 architects. Will Bruder from Arizona, who had designed the wonderful, in Houston, CAM in Houston, but and also the wonderful Phoenix Public Library space. Carlos Ferreter, who was a very, still not well known in the United States, but a very, very interesting Spanish architect that William Curtis had encouraged us to talk to. Annette Gigon and Mike Guier, who had designed the Kirchner Museum in Davos, Switzerland, and they were based in Zurich. Jacques Herzog and Pierre Dumoulin, who were the kind of best known of the people that we asked. And Terry Good and I had met Jacques Herzog down at the Chinati Foundation. They did one of their seminar type things called Art and Architecture, and and he was there giving a talk there, and so we kind of had
But
talked
at
to
the
him.
time we put them on the list, they had not built
Nothing.
in this country. By the time they came.
Herzog and Dumoulin.
Right.
Yeah, Herzog and
right.
Dumoulin had not built, but we had done a show with Peter Bloom of Thomas Roof's photographs of Herzog and Dumoulin buildings. And so we felt, oh, they're, these guys are great. And the fascinating thing was, kind of crazy fascinating, was that they invited Rem Koolhaas to be part of their team.
With their
Oh,
team.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I
Yes.
Called
didn't
up and
realize
said-
that.
Oh, yeah. He called up, Jacques called up and said, well, now, this is a little bit odd, but we were thinking it might be fun. And we're going to say no. He was worried because it hadn't gone through the proper channels of the architect selection. And we're like, oh, no, come, bring him on. And and the talk was great because it was like rock star. Remember, Steve, we had to set up closed circuit cameras in the gallery. It was spilling out into it was wild. That was worth it
It
alone.
was rock star talk, and it was great. But when he and Jacques Herzog came to the site, Koolhaas spent about 30 seconds looking at it, turned on his heel, took out his phone, and that was the end of his interest.
True. And Jacques felt so bad.
Oh, well, yeah, right, because he had been the sort of last invited to
right.
the party and the first to
But,
leave.
we got our money's worth because
it
the
was
talk
great.
was fabulous.
And it was, and it was. And it was, there is no possible way that those groups could work on a 20,000 square foot building ever. I mean,
On a low
so,
budget.
Yeah. Enrique Norten, who also hadn't built, I think he built one thing in
I
Philadelphia.
think he'd done a parking garage at Princeton. He's a Mexican architect. His firm is called 10 Arquitectos.
And then we felt, because again, we kept with the mission of the institution and what we did, and you guys still do, so we felt it was very important to have a local firm, regional, somebody within the Midwest or St. Louis, and knowing that we couldn't, those of us St. Louisans on the committee couldn't make that selection, we asked William
Riley.
Curtis and Terry Riley to make that selection, and he selected Elva Rubio and Philip Durham, who were partners at the time. And Phil is still a wonderful architect here in St. Louis. And they had this exact same treatment as every other architect. They did their talk, which was great. And we had a really wonderful meeting with them here. And then the last on the list was Peter Zumthor, who also had never built in this country at that
And
time.
to this day, I don't
Has
think
he?
he has.
He's had a lot of possible.
Yes,
That's the way
well,
he is, too.
he's been asked by the Los Angeles County Museum to do a big plan for their expansion redo, but has never built here. But, well, I may be jumping ahead, but after we made the selection, various of us went on trips to see the architect's work. And we had a fantastic experience seeing Peter Zumthor's work.
Yeah.
So again, we got our money's worth, even though he was never going to be appropriate for this job.
Yeah. And we thought, yeah, it was possible. We didn't invite people that we knew for sure we would never do it. But by the end of the process of
We knew.
we knew who might work and who might not work. And when Peter said, I don't work with budgets. What's a budget?
And you took your red pen and you crossed it off.
Yeah, and also after going to see his absolutely exquisite buildings, he shouldn't work with a budget. He's one of those architects. So, and then of course, Brad Klopfel, Allied Works Architecture.
Who at that point had done the,
Wyden Kennedy Building,
that's right.
Which was a
redo.
redo or
gut
an
rehab,
addition
yeah.
to an existing building.
That was it. He'd just done Wyden Kennedy. And he was someone that Terry Riley turned us on to and said, go look at, because we wanted broad representation. So he came, and they all came, and they were all great. And some, as Emmy mentioned, were more engaged than others.
And you had language gaps with some.
Well, the language gap was really with Carlos
Yeah.
Ferreter, who only spoke Spanish.
Yeah. But he had a wonderful assistant who did a great job
Yeah.
with this English.
And we went to Barcelona and saw some wonderful things that he had done.
Mhm. He was definitely, I think, our European of choice.
And how
But-
did you come to the decision? Was that from the selection committee, or was that?
Yes, the selection committee met, but one of the things we did, which I loved doing at the lectures, we had different people introduce each one of the lectures, so that was fun to get connect different people in the community with the architects. And we also, remember, we had questionnaires that we gave to the audience. And we asked for comments back, and we were very clear. We said, now, you don't get a vote, but we do want to hear what you think about these architects, and if you have any questions that you think that we need to address with them. And I remember in one case, in Will Bruder's case, and actually in Carlos Ferreter's case, the big questions were, have they ever built anywhere where it gets below 70 degrees? And how are they going to do that? So good, practical, solid questions, and some people were, loved it, and some people were like, you're crazy if you go this way. So that was great. So we read through all of those, all of the questionnaire sheets, and we had visited a lot of people, and a number of people were kind of knocked out pretty easily. And then it was just a matter of just sitting and talking and then making a decision.
So I wonder if we can go back to, you were talking about some of the exhibitions that you had done while at the forum, and sort of the space and these these two different floors and the kind of limitations of space. And as you were envisioning this permanent home, no matter what the architect was, clearly you were already thinking about space on a bigger scale, right? You were going to have more room to move around in. Mm-hmm. And I'm just kind of curious, if you go through some of the programmatic thinking that you were involved with at the forum, what did you think then was also going to happen programmatically at this? I mean, I say big place because I'm obviously looking at this volume, but I'm curious.
And this is where I wish Mel and Roseanne were here, because we had just a great team of people. I mean, just so much heart. And Mel Watkin was our curator, and Shannon Fitzpatrick was our assistant curator. And they, of course, had all kinds of ideas for things. And then Mel was Roseanne was our education program person. We had a lot smaller staff back then, which is probably why the office space here is tight, because we never knew that there would need to be that many offices. We were sort of, because we were all pretty much, remember, we'd all just, I'm looking at Dana because she was our front desk, she was a student and was our front desk person, and we all just kind of hung around in one pile.
We only had 2 computers that had email.
That's right.
My computer had email and Betsy's computer had email. So
Yeah.
Shannon and Mel would wait around for me to leave.
Yeah.
Use my computer so they could email.
Yeah. And part of that was because we couldn't get email to the 3rd floor because there was so much concrete, and it would cost too much money to actually wire it up there. So,
We're also using Mac 2s. You guys remember those?
Yes.
we thought we were pretty technological. Yeah. But so the space, there were certain aspects that we liked about being in the old space, and a lot of that had to do with the staff being really in the galleries, essentially. And so the interaction of staff with patrons it was great. People would be walking around. Roseanne's desk was, smack dab in the middle of the 3rd floor gallery. And they would always ask her questions about, what the artwork, what the heck is this? And she would, stop what she was doing and talk to them. I would hear people coming in. We had a doorbell system. So you had to ring the doorbell and then somebody had to buzz you in. And so, you'd hear people come in and you'd come out to make sure they found their way in and didn't, go bug rack too much. So there was a lot of interaction, and we liked that.
Were you afraid of losing that kind of intimacy in a different sort of building?
Yeah, which is why, you know, you have these overhangs, and in a way, the space, you know, up here was gonna be was the education department. So we told Roseanne, you're never gonna not be in the middle of the gallery. You're always gonna have to be looking out and talking to people and saying, hey, don't touch that. So, because we all did everything. And so, yeah, so we did, and at the time, because that was sort of, we conceived of it as program education going on over there, we realized that the rest of us would have to walk back and forth across the catwalk all the time, and so we'd be watching and looking out and seeing if there were, you know, friends here, say hi, and, you know, so we wanted that, and I think you still have some of that.
Well, I think it's interesting because even though, you know, the offices, the majority of people are in one place and there's a closed door, or can be a closed door, it's very rarely closed, you still do indeed get a sense of what's happening down here the second you walk out of the staff offices, you know. So it is pretty transparent in that way, which is really nice. The funny thing about, you know, the offices are the children's play space and the youth education gallery. And do you know, every institution I have ever worked, we've always taken over office space and made it into programmatic space.
I think that's great.
I mean, it's a really interesting thing. This is, you know, it's like you can't help yourself. Programmatically, you see, you know, 100 square feet and you think, oh.
What can we do in
What can we put in there? So I think it's very funny because it's happened everywhere, and I think it's interesting that it was planned to be, you know, administrative, and that too. I mean, it's gone the way of the real education offices in the sense of, you know, what it's used for.
Which is great.
Yeah.
Betsy, may I?
Yeah.
Betsy, how was your transition from being a curator at the Art Museum to being an administrator? You also did some curating. And then about the addition of museum as part of the name. What was the discussion and thought process for that?
Okay. Well, at the time, when I came to the forum, there was no curator. It was me and Eric Azal and Susan. I just blanked. I knew I'd blank at some point. Susan. Anyway, I don't see her.
Wehrmeyer.
No.
No?
Susan Lee, thank you,
Lee.
the simplest of last names. So I was curator. And probably not that good of an administrator, but, you know, I had lots of good help on the board. And then Deb Godwin came as our first development director. And she started at 555 Washington. And so we were a pretty small staff. And and then Mel Watkin, I first did, one of the first shows I did in the old space, the 555 Washington, was a show called East Side, West Side. 2 artists from Illinois, 2 artists from St. Louis. And Mel was one of the artists from Illinois. And I met her as an exhibiting artist, and we started talking, and she explained that she had a curatorial background. So I'm like, oh, good. Let's do something. And so she hit the ground running, and I think her first show, I'm trying to think if her first show was On Beyond the Book, which Buzz was in, which was an awesome show. And she did wonderful shows. And she started part-time, because she drove up from Carbondale. And so she'd be there 2 days a week, and then that kind of, she always made it work. And so the first real full-time curator I think we ever hired was Shannon.
And when was that? Was that when it was still the former, or was that not?
That was ramping up.
That was,
for
okay.
This. We were over here in Grand Center, but we were realizing that this was going to happen, so we needed more people. So, and the discussion around the museum. Do you remember that? Changing the name discussion.
Not details, sorry.
I know we went back and forth, but I remember getting the dictionary.
Well, here,
out.
Terry.
Do you remember that?
For the longest time, there was resistance to using the word museum because we emphasized our Kunsthalle origins. And we wanted to make that distinction that we were not
Oh, there you go.
We were emphasizing,
Yeah.
we were emphasizing our Kunsthalle origins, and there was some feeling that museum implied a permanent collection. So we quickly corrected people when they talked about it being a museum. And I think we were also trying to emphasize the fact that we were cutting edge and quick on our feet and things of that nature. But we also gradually got to the point where we believed that we wanted to emphasize that we were an institution. And we wanted that permanent home. And it became more and more obvious that we were going to be that permanent thing there.
And there is, I mean, it does also make sense because if you think about it across the country, the two kind of categories of name that are most often used for non-collecting contemporary institutions, you have ICAs and you have CAMs.
Right.
So it's not without, precedent
Exactly.
to certainly understand that you can, be contemporary art museum and not collect. So it does make sense. I mean, Houston is the oldest non-collecting museum in the United States. And so that's a CAM too. But it is true, it feels solid,
Yes.
heavy,
Yes.
serious.
Sabina.
I just want to say one little thing, because we always have these discussions that the Kunsthalle is a non-collecting institution. That's actually really not true. All the big Kunsthalles, they're obviously all in Austria and in Germany. They are collecting institutions. It's a 19th century tradition in which artists were involved.
Ah.
And the public in the city, and they all have major collections. So it's funny because I always hear this German word, and I thought at some point I have to correct that.
Yeah.
Kunsthalle is a collecting institution. There's maybe one or two you might find. When it's not collecting, it's the Kunstverein, but not the Kunsthalle, where figure, Kunsthalle Mannheim, or Bremen, or they're major collections. Just as a side note.
Good note. We had Larry.
On the banister.
Oh, that's right. That was one of the links, yeah.
So I guess the next thing I would just be very curious is, once the building was up and you were getting to where you were going, my curiosity is what surprised you the most, what you didn't expect. And I mean that either architecturally or in terms of what it was going to mean programmatically. Was there anything that wasn't expected, or did you envision it to be what it then became?
That's a question for, I wasn't here. When I left, the building was coming out of the ground.
So it was, so there was a foundation, it had begun, but
Pretty
it was
much
not a
that was it.
completed construction.
No, it was not. And so Paul had a lot to do along with the board, I think, because that's a major part of what the board was doing with this part of it. So you guys might, John, you. Yeah. So I didn't see it until the opening night.
What'd you think?
I thought it was pretty awesome. It was a little bit different. The front room was added, you remember, and the whole, and it was in some ways, Brad probably talked about this when he was here, about these tensions and this sort of feeling of going under that space and then things opening up. That was much more, I think, it was much more effective before the front room, but the front room's great for being able for programs. So I think that changed the space slightly. The program needed to change the space a little bit. But I think, it's great to see the windows open. We fought about those windows, Brad, and I fought about those windows because I was like, absolutely not, no windows. We had windows in the first floor, well, both floors of the Grand Center building, Ronnie's building. And we remember we cut like really ugly Luan panels and put them up with mirror clips and painted them different. just to keep the light out. And so I was like, we're not doing it. And Brad was like, no, we're gonna have windows, because if you put the wall up, you say you want to bring the people in, but you put a wall up. So it became this whole thing. And we decided that, well, you know, we've closed them up before. If we need to close them up, they can be closed up.
He wanted you to be able to see all the way through, remember?
Yes, that's right. You're right. He did. Yeah, you could stand on that corner and see through.
And you can, when the performance wall is down,
Yeah.
it is a very, very, it's a straight shot,
Yeah.
it's very transparent. Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's right. And had we had more money, the performance wall would have been a movable wall system. But that was one of the things that went in the budget. That went pretty early, too.
And when Brad was coming up with the design, was there any give or take with Ando? Did Ando have any editing with it? If he hated the design or hated a part of it, was there any give and take between the two of them?
Basically, Ando didn't like the idea of a young unknown architect building next to him. I think he wanted Stephen Hull. Knowing that, I had a very uncomfortable weekend when we were under construction. Ando came. Brad had just gotten the commission, so he hadn't started to design. And Richard Serra came with a model for the sculpture. And basically, the goal for this meeting was to connect the two spaces and to place the sculpture. Interestingly, Richard Serra suggested the curve along Spring for this building, and in drawings, Ando had done it. And here were three men with very big egos, and Richard Serra really was the one who made it work, because
He was the peacekeeper.
he really,
He really
which
was.
So interesting.
you know, was not what I had expected. And what happened as a result was, you know, this building is 14 feet lower than our building. So we had to deal with that transition. And Richard wanted his sculpture on the lowest level near the building so that you had a vertical wall to measure yourself against. And when Ando saw the model for the sculpture, he changed the windows in our building to the narrow horizontal windows. Originally, they were planned to be vertical and much wider. And he cut the windows in our model, just in the perfect place, which was an incredible response to the sculpture. And thank goodness we weren't up that high, so we could make the change.
Yeah.
Sorry, but I mean, you said, I believe, the Pulitzer Foundation building was 2 years prior to this building being started.
It took us a little while.
I'm
'Cause
just trying to understand, so there were still,
This building was being designed
okay, so it was in the design.
Yeah.
in the middle and latter part of our construction. Because as I say, when Brad first got the commission, we were already under construction, but we weren't as high as the windows.
Yeah.
When Brad came, he he was talking through sort of how he really was designing and thinking in reaction to and as complement to the Ando. So for him, that was, you know, such an extraordinarily important touchstone and sort of benchmark that he would sort of design against. At least, you know, that was sort of how he thought about it, and that the changes in this building, the openness, that there were certain things that he wanted very much to be a dialogue in complement to. So he was, you know, deeply influenced and inspired by that building and by Ando, which I think is
And I
interesting.
think the one decision that he made about this building, which is to some degree questionable, is building it in concrete. And the use of concrete, of course, is very different than the way it is in the Ando building. But so many people think we're one institution. So many people think, oh, if you're doing something modern, it's got to be concrete, and I don't like concrete. There's that confusion and attitude that I think is a slight negative.
It's true because it is a totally different handling. But it is also true that people still, after all of this time, conflate the two structures totally.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And we do have, it's kind of fun. We actually programmatically have people here all the time that say, is this the Pulitzer? And the Pulitzer has people all the time that say, is this the Contemporary? So it actually, in a funny way, it sort of works for us. We get a good kind of cross-contamination of audience in that way. But it is really interesting that it is not perceived as a difference. You're quite right.
Because as you probably realize, there is no concrete building tradition in St. Louis. There were a few brutalist buildings that were built and were mostly hated, and the law school at WashU was then torn down. There's, a building downtown that was a hotel, I think. But there is no concrete tradition here as there is in a city like Boston.
Did Brad say anything about the great signal light controversy? Do you remember that?
Out here,
Yeah,
about changing it, or,
getting rid of it. Remember, he couldn't stand that signal.
well, true.
The
There was-
traffic light?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Well, there was a turn lane.
Yeah.
So kind of right in the gallery there would have been a turn lane, and we were able to get rid of that because that's it's a huge street. It was sort of like, why do they, 2 lanes and a turn lane for that street? But and he tried to get them to get rid of the signal light just because he thought it was, clutter, visual clutter. But, yeah. But, I think one of the things that he saw, he had done work in concrete, and I think one of the things that he saw when he was here was some of the way the city is laid out, the way the roadways work. I think of this concrete as being it is a completely different building material than that building. It's bridge construction, in a sense, and with the spans and the points of weight, like that corner right there, which is one of my favorite spots. That it's completely different than the way the Ando was conceived and designed.
And the mesh.
And the mesh, yeah, the mesh was meant to cover a lot of that. So.
Well, Betsy, go back
No.
and talk more about the exhibitions at the downtown.
We did a lot. I brought my cheat sheets. We did 4 to 6 exhibits a year.
And one at a time? Given the space, it was...
Sometimes there were 2.
Okay.
Because when we were over here, we had 2 floors. So sometimes they'd mix. We opened here. I'm trying to remember what we had at 555. We closed 555 with Brian Weil, the AIDS Project, and we opened over here with. We opened with the Exuberant 80s. The survey showed that Emmy and I went around and asked people to loan us stuff. And it was 1991, I think. So, or somewhere right in there.
But St. Louis hadn't seen the 80s.
But there was many things St. Louis had. Yeah, never been a Jeff Koons piece here. Never been a Francesco Clemente here. Ronny had shown David Sally, I think, but I don't know. Had you shown? I don't think there'd been a Schnabel So we went mostly to Chicago. Gerald Elliott was still alive. We borrowed from him. Lou Manilow loaned us a lot of pieces. We had a great Peter Halley in the show. And Jan Greenberg wrote a wonderful gallery guide for it. And that's what we opened with. And we really didn't have a lot of time to put it together. But I think that's when Lou Manilow called us the dynamic duo. And Joe Pulitzer was with us on the trip, and he hated all of it. He was like, this is art. He hated it. But he, didn't he? He was like, really? But then we had a wonderful moment of collaboration with the St. Louis Art Museum, who had taken an exhibition, a contemporary German photography that Gary Garrels had organized for the Walker Art Center. And Gary insisted that the show not be edited. If it didn't fit, he said, find a way to make it fit. So Michael came to us and said, would you consider having part of the show here at the forum? And we were like, absolutely. So we got what I thought was all the good stuff. And they had the older, so we kind of split it.
Cherry-picked.
We split it at the, I think it was artists who came to maturity in the 80s were here, and then the older, more established artists were at the Art Museum. So that was great. Those were both really great. I mean, we had some shows. We showed Martin Kippenberger in '93, Joseph Beuys in '94. We did
Robert Goldberg.
That's right, Robert Goldberg. Now, was he in Altered States? We had some great group shows. Jeannie Greenberg did a wonderful group show for us. That was the Altered States, American Art in the 90s, which we actually got in during the 90s, 1995. I mentioned the Herzog and de Meuron show, On Beyond the Book, which was a great exhibit. We showed Kara Walker, Shazia Sikandar, Barry McGee. Margaret Kilgallen was alive at that time and did a wall drawing. We did 2 projects with William Kentridge. So we did a lot of stuff.
That's a pretty amazing list. How
And then
was it received?
Ask these guys. You were there.
Well,
Actually,
was the viewing audience sort of the same kind of viewing audience that comes here now? Was it different? Was it,
It was
bigger,
smaller.
smaller?
I think it was smaller, definitely.
And I think it was older. I mean, I think that Paul and now you have done just a fabulous job in involving young people.
Yeah. I think there's more young people now, don't you?
It just seems that way.
Everyone seems younger now. But we also, those are the, as my late husband would say, those were the wall bangers, that everybody knows the names. But we also...
But they didn't necessarily at that time know the
No,
names. That's the
not.
thing, right? This sort of launching pad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And people loved coming to St. Louis. I was thrilled because all of these artists really wanted to come to St. Louis. The European artists that we worked with, we did that wonderful exhibit with Ulrich Gorlick, a Swiss photographer who came and coated the walls of the building with photo emulsion and then delved into the St. Louis Post-Dispatch photo archives and used images of St. Louis history, showing the photograph as it ran in the paper, the backside of the photograph with all the edits, and you were immersed in this.
And it was printed on the
Printed
walls.
directly into the walls. So, I don't know, Ronnie, did you tear those walls down when you rebuilt? Because there's great art in those walls. Really great art in those walls. There you go. But we always felt it was important to include St. Louis artists, and I think our biggest crowds were for St. Louis artists.
Mm-hmm.
So we showed Sabina Ott, we showed Van, there are lots, sometimes in group shows, sometimes Michael Byron did a beautiful drawing show there. That was towards the end. The last show when I was there was the Radcliffe Bailey show, The Magic City, which was a great show. So it was fun. It was wild.
What kind of critical discourse went around these shows?
We had Bobby, and we, that was one of those things we talked a lot about, because we would occasionally get some national. We'd get occasionally a stringer would write for Art Forum or something like that. Usually a little blurb. Locally, it was Riverfront Times and the Post-Dispatch.
And no, who was on the Globe?
We didn't have the, early.
No,
John Broad Peters.
John Broad Peters.
So you had
there,
current
at least three
three-
visual arts
God,
critics.
how great.
Which is totally different today.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Mary King.
Yeah.
She'd review a lot. But there wasn't a lot. I mean, we tried to have more of that sort of discourse around the programs. And the New Art in the Neighborhood program was started as part of, actually, the idea, and I think it was about the time Kara Walker came. I think she was one of the first artists to work with the kids. With the idea, though, and that was also a WashU collaboration. Joe Deal, who was the dean of the art school at the time, and Serra, graphic designer. Sarah Spur, thank you. Were very concerned about where the next generation of students was going to come from, and particularly how to get their classes more diverse. And at the time, and still the case, I imagine, there's no art in the schools, certainly not in the public schools. And we had failed miserably at getting the public schools involved. We had a program with the Brian Weil Show, the AIDS Project, to bring students to the museum to see it, and they sent the teachers, and they were like, no way. We are so not bringing these kids to see. And the show wasn't, I mean, there were great images and great messages and discussion possibilities there, but they were too afraid of it. And so we kind of just said, we don't have time, money, and ability to do this. So we started with the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And we started with the church across the street. And we said, do you have kids who, because they had an after-school program, and we said, do you have kids who sit in the corner and doodle? And they're like, oh yeah. And we're like, we want those kids. And so that started to grow out of that. And the idea was to put them together with the artists who were showing, and particularly to ask the artists who were showing to talk about how to be an artist, and that it's okay to be an artist, and that, you can make it your life if that's what you really want. And Roseanne did an incredible job with that program. Just incredible.
They were good talks, too. We had, folding chairs and the main gallery.
That was the other thing that we wanted for this space, was to figure out, because we always did our programs, well, we didn't have a separate space, so we always did our programs in the galleries. And I remember particularly because we worked a lot with New Music Circle, and those guys would bring all this stuff and set it up in the gallery, and you'd just be sitting there listening to, for me, discordant music. But you'd start making connections between the sounds and the visual, and it really was pretty cool. And you do that when you were talking with artists or collectors or anybody who came to speak. You just started, your mind could wander visually. And that we wanted to kind of keep, so we didn't want this space to be an auditorium. Mm-hmm. That was very important. We went so many museums where they had the auditorium and the doors were closed and they were only open for a talk. So we wanted more of a forum.
Any other questions? People have been good. They've been piping up, which has been excellent. Any other closing thoughts? Oh, sorry, yes.
I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about audience and the audience that you felt you would be serving by building this building.
Good question. I'm trying to think if we had a lot of thought, specific thought. I think we were a little, and Emmy, you could speak to this as well, because it was so, and Ronny as well, because Grant Center was so embryonic. And, we knew that, there's a symphony audience, there's a Fox audience. We didn't know what the Pulitzer audience was going to be at that time because it hadn't opened yet. I think you were still trying to figure out what that audience was going to be.
And it has changed over the years.
And yeah, we knew the audience that we had, and we knew that there was we had a pretty diverse audience, I'd say. We have a great bunch of people who'd been with the institution for a long time as audience, always came, to things. But we knew that there was this sort of other audience out there, this younger audience that we were trying to get to.
Yeah, and to extend that, I thought I was part of your audience.
Yeah.
In the 90s.
Yeah.
I was willing to make the
Yeah,
80-mile round
you
trip,
came from,
to see shows because you made it worth my while.
Wow.
yeah.
My first show here was the German photography.
Oh, was it?
That blew me away.
Yeah,
Oh,
that was a great
That
show.
was really amazing.
And I do have to say, we did always have, at least in the time I was here, and I think prior as well, we had a great artist audience. The artists liked this space and liked what we did, and we included them a lot. We had a lot of great openings and parties after the openings, which were, in those days, were small enough, so they just kind of moved from there to my house, down the block, so.
That's commitment. That is
Oh, man.
commitment, Betsy.
Burnout.
But when we went to a lot of the big companies to raise money for the capital fund to build this building, part of the appeal was that they were hiring a lot of younger people that we thought would come here. And that was part of the appeal of getting money from the Emersons and the big companies to support this construction. Whether it was true, whether it worked, whether they believed it, I think that's where you got a lot of
The initial funds, yeah. Yep.
Along those same lines, I'm wondering whether your proximity to Harris Stowe State University and St. Louis University has changed, has developed, and maybe this is more for you, Lisa, I don't know. I mean, I know there's always a great working relationship with Washington University, maybe because of its programs, but what about the other two universities you're in the midst of?
Well, I would say those, in terms of proximity, we do have a lot of students and professors that bring their classes here, so we have a lot of interaction. But I would actually say that what I find very interesting is that we also have a lot of interaction and collaborative programs with UMSL and Webster and students in those places as well. So in a funny way, yes, we happen to be across the street, quite literally, from SLU and right down the street from Harris Stowe. But I would say we have a fairly kind of even audience and usage from many of the colleges and universities in the area. And in almost all cases, that comes through the professors. Do you know what I mean? That really is about professors bringing their students or having them come for a particular lecture or to review a show more than it is them sort of wandering in.
So you still they don't wander in? Because
They do.
wanted that so badly. and it
They
never
do,
happened.
but I have to say not as much as you would suspect given the physical
location.
proximity. Yeah. And they park here. Maybe want to go out there and have one of those, those blow-up guys that says, "Come on, you guys, come on in."
Come on in.
So.
Yeah.
Well, I cannot thank you both enough for this. This has been, as I said, I think a very informative, very educational, and a very moving year in many ways, because I do think that institutions like these, whether they be glass or concrete or metal or whatever they are really built in the hearts and the minds of the people who make them come to fruition. And it has been a deeply engaging process to learn about it. And I thank you both so much for your time and your insights and your vision. So thank you.
Well, thank this. Fun for us. Well, thank you. You all are really lucky to have Lisa. I think she's one of the things that came up over and over again as an institution grows is this institution has found the right person at the right time for its growth, and you're entering a great chapter. So
Thank you, Betsy.
great.